Welcome to this Circles of Support and Accountability training video. My name is Dr. Robin Wilson, and this video was produced in conjunction with the United States Department of Justice and is part of a larger project regarding Circles of Support and Accountability development in the United States. I recognize that this video may be of some use to people who are not involved in Circles projects, and what I want to let you know is that there is a PowerPoint that is associated with this video that you can download either from the DOJ website under the Circles of Support and Accountability Project, or you can get it from my personal website, which is www.robinjwilson.com. And if you go to the Circles of Support and Accountability tab on my website, you'll find the PowerPoint there, as well as a link to this video. The topic of this short video is going to be sexual deviance. And I'm going to be speaking about this from the perspective of people who are volunteering in a circle of support and accountability, although some of the information might be helpful for others as well. The first thing that I think we need to acknowledge is that our conception of what constitutes sexual deviance is somewhat of a moving target, and that as our morality changes, as we grow as a species, as we have different perspectives on the issue of sexuality, what we consider to be normal and what we consider to be abnormal changes quite considerably. If you were to go back to the 1950s, for example, the attitudes and values that people had about homosexuality would be quite different than they are today. Of course, today we're much more accepting, and it hasn't been since the early 1970s that we considered homosexuality to be a psychiatric disorder. So clearly we've changed there. In the recent past, we've also seen an awful lot of movement with respect to how we consider people who are trans. So folks who are questioning what their gender is, whether they're male, female, or somewhere in the middle, or whether they choose to be no gender. And that's relatively recent, and a lot of us are still trying to sort of get our head around who gets called what under what circumstances. And of course that's part of the growth of the human species, and learning how better to understand what makes us unique and interesting. So one of the greatest difficulties we experience when we're trying to quantify, or at least qualify, what constitutes deviant sexual activity or deviant sexual interests is, in some senses, it's a social construction. There are other things that I think are quite obvious, although some people might not consider that to be true. I mean, I personally believe that a physically mature person should not be having sexual interactions with a physically immature person. I also believe that if the person that you believe is your sexual partner is not giving informed consent to that behavior, then I don't believe that that's reasonable behavior either. Although in both contexts, I'm not entirely sure that the reason for the behavior would be necessarily sexually deviant. I think we can certainly look at the behaviors as being sexually and socially inappropriate. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But, certainly one of the hurdles to defining sexual deviance is a lack of clarity as to what actually constitutes deviant or offensive sexual behavior. And I guess I'd ask everyone who's watching this video to consider for a moment, what do you consider to be sexually offensive? My guess is that if you're sitting in a room and there are others in the room, that what you consider to be sexually offensive may not be the same as what the person besides you considers to be sexually offensive. And I guess you'd have to ask yourself, how well does your morality regarding sexuality match that of others in your greater community? Are you an outlier? Are you someone who's quite liberal, or someone who's quite conservative, or do you fall somewhere in the middle? And certainly if you're in the United States or Canada or any of the other nations that are similar to those two, chances are that there will be more people like you than people not like you. But if you were to go to some other countries, say for instance Iran, or maybe India, or maybe China, or a wide variety of different places, maybe Sweden, what constitutes okay sexual behavior in those places may not necessarily be the same as what you find in your own jurisdiction. So I guess the first thing to say is there are some things that are kind of easy to figure out, and they're sort of no-brainers. And one of the ones that I would suggest would be, physically mature people having sexual interactions with physically immature people. So adults and children, adults and most specifically prepubescent or sort of early pubescent children. At the same time, if you're having sex with someone and that person hasn't given explicit informed consent, then I think you're also probably going to get yourself in some trouble at some point. So when we conceptualize problematic sexual conduct, I suppose there are three different ways we can look at this. The behavior may be deviant in that it's unusual or very atypical. This can be in your sexual interests or your sexual preferences. So things that are, quite considerably off the beaten path, things that not a lot of people would be engaging in. So that may be deviant, but it's not necessarily unlawful, right? I mean, if it floats your boat to wear thong underwear because that makes you sexually aroused, I suppose that's perfectly fine as long as you pay your taxes, feed your children, go to PTA meetings, and get up and go to work in the morning, and it doesn't affect you or others. I suppose, as I said, whatever floats your boat. We know that there are a lot of couples who also engage in consenting bondage and discipline. The English like to call this slap and tickle. There's a certain point at which you may look at that, or the ordinary person might look at that and say there's something deviant about that, but it's not necessarily unlawful. Whatever you do in the privacy of your own home, as long as everybody's consenting and nobody's getting harmed and everybody's still able to function as a normal human being outside of that, I'm not sure that we should have all that much to say about that. Of course, there are some deviant sexual behaviors, like having sex with prepubescent children, or exposing yourself to strangers, or peeping in windows, or being sexually excited by causing physical harm to others. Those deviant behaviors are often going to get you into some trouble with the law. So in this instance, behaviors that are unlawful could be deviant, but don't necessarily have to be, right? I mean, certainly when we think about having sex with people against their will, we have laws against that. So the behavior is unlawful, but the reason why people engage in that behavior may not necessarily be because they're fundamentally deviant in their sexual interests or preferences. Maybe they're quite antisocial and they just don't care about what happens to other people as they're meeting their needs. The same thing goes with respect to child molestation. Not every single person who has sexual interactions with a child is necessarily pedophilic. Some people engage in that behavior for other reasons, which are sometimes complicated, but involve things like blurred boundaries, substance abuse, family stress, blockage of access to normal sexual interactions with age-appropriate partners. There are a large number of variables that can impinge on that sort of scenario, but it's safe to say that not every person who is sexually interacting with a child is necessarily pedophilic, which would be the psychiatric diagnosis that would go along with a very strong interest or perhaps even a sexual preference for children. So unlawful behavior can be something like, for instance, peeing behind a tree. If you're out at the pub and you're a young fellow and you don't quite make it home and you pee behind a tree, you could get charged with indecent exposure, which is an unlawful act, which has something to do with sexuality on some level, I guess, but we'd be hard-pressed to say that that was sexually deviant. There are other unlawful sexual behaviors that also don't necessarily have to be deviant in and of themselves either. The last characterization I'm going to talk about is things that are hypersexual. So here we're talking about not so much what the behavior is, but the frequency with which people engage in it, or the frequency in which people engage in it, whatever is the right way to say it. So somebody who engages in a very high frequency of engagement in a certain type of behavior might be considered to be might be considered to be hypersexual. So someone who who is an exhibitionist, we know that this is a high density offending pattern, and often people engage in this at a quite high frequency. That would be an instance of a hypersexual behavior that is both perhaps deviant and also unlawful. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. If you sit in your office at home until all hours of the night, sort of masturbating, frequently to normative pornographic stuff that you see on the internet, you're not necessarily breaking any laws, but you're certainly probably at some point going to find some negative experiences in life because of how much time you're putting into masturbating while you're downloading pornography. If the pornography that you're downloading is child pornography, then of course that means something different. So you're both hypersexual and unlawful, and if we believe the research literature, very likely to be someone who has pedophilic interests. So that would be another instance where there's a nexus between the deviant aspect, the unlawful aspect, and the hypersexual aspect. When we talk about things that are sexually deviant, these are behaviors that are quite atypical. They're unusual, perhaps abnormal in the sort of statistical sense, in that not a lot of people engage in them. And they would be behaviors that, most normal people, whatever normal is, would consider the behaviors to be strange, odd, or perhaps even concerning. As I said, not all sexually deviant behaviors are necessarily illegal. So you can have people who have various fetishes. If someone wants to dress up in female clothing because it makes them sexually aroused and because they enjoy the experience, as I said before, whatever floats your boat. If it doesn't interfere with your ability to function as a normal human being in other aspects of your life, and as long as it doesn't impact the lives of others, that's your own business, I would say. However, there are some aspects of sexually deviant conduct that would be considered illegal in most or all circumstances. And some of the examples I've used already would be sexual molestation of prepubescent children and exhibitionism, the act of exposing yourself to a stranger. These would be both sexually deviant and also illegal. So let's talk about sexually inappropriate stuff. So this is a slightly different conceptualization here. And I guess what we would have to ask ourselves is there something about the circumstances or the context in which these behaviors are occurring that would suggest some degree of sexual impropriety? For instance, both partners may be consenting to the sexual behaviors, or they may not. Is there some element of coercion? Is there a power differential? Is there something that would limit the capacity of one of those two individuals to consent to the behavior? Now, there doesn't necessarily have to be sexual deviance here, in that the behavior might be quite reasonable. It's the context in which it occurs. So sex between two adults, not particularly deviant, but when you take away the element of consent, then you start to get into the aspect of it being sexually inappropriate, probably unlawful, but again, not necessarily sexually deviant in and of itself, unless the fact that there was coercion was what was driving the sexual arousal for the person who was engaging in that coercion. There may be something else that may point to it being sexually inappropriate. We generally have an incest taboo, in that we don't believe that blood relatives should be having sex with one another, although the acts themselves, the actual physical act of having sex may not be a sexually deviant behavior. The context and the parties who are engaging in that sexual behavior would make it something that we would consider to be sexually inappropriate. In most circumstances, things that are considered to be sexually inappropriate would also be unlawful. The last bit I want to talk about is socially inappropriate behaviors that are sexual in nature. And here we'd have to ask ourselves, is there something about the circumstances of the behavior that gives us cause for concern, but the conduct itself may not necessarily be deviant or all that inappropriate. So here we would talk about consenting sex in a public place, or sex between partners where there's some element of a power differential, but it's not really perhaps an obvious one. Influence of alcohol and drugs may have some part in it here as well. Depending on the circumstances, socially inappropriate sexual behaviors may be illegal, but it's not necessarily an absolute. For instance, once upon a time, and I'm dating myself, there used to be a lot of what we called streaking. This was people taking their clothes off and sort of running through a sporting event or doing something, mostly as a lark to get laughs and to have fun. But since the advent of things like sex offender registries and our changing perspectives on what constitutes reasonable sexual conduct, that sort of behavior doesn't happen nearly as much as it used to. Although for the most part, as I said, it was intended to be a joke, and it was not really intended to be something that was sexually offensive. So we've talked about things that are sexually deviant, sexually inappropriate, and socially inappropriate. I think we also have to make a distinction when talking about sexual deviance and what inherently turns people on. We need to make a distinction between our sexual preferences and our sexual appetites. So I think everyone probably, if you were to sit them down and say, so what would your perfect partner look like? Or what would your perfect, sexual scenario be? What they would describe is probably something not exactly what they would normally do in their sex lives. All of us have that sort of idealized person that we'd like to be sexually involved with. For guys, it'd be I'll be stereotypical and say whoever's on the front cover of the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue, or for women it might be Johnny Depp or Brad Pitt or whoever is the go-to guy now. I guess Chris Hemsworth is somebody that I hear women talk about. And of course I'm being kind of stereotypical here, but how often do people marry Chris Hemsworth? How often do people marry a Sports Illustrated swimsuit model? That may be your perfect partner or your idealized partner, but obviously we're willing to think about other sorts of people, because it's not just about how we look or what our personality is. It's a mix of both, right? We look for other things. So how often do we actually get what our preference is? So clearly we're willing to go outside of that sort of perfect ideal. We're open to consideration of a wide variety of different people. And if, most adults have had sex maybe with more than one person at some point in their life. If you put those two people side by side, how much would they look the same? How close are their personalities? So, we have to ask ourselves about, what is it that we'd consider, under what circumstances, and, how much does that reflect what our preference is versus things that we'd be perfectly happy with, and there's no good reason not to be perfectly happy with. When we talk about sexual offenders, and I'm not greatly, happy with that term, and I think many of us in the field have tried to move over to person-first language. So instead of saying sex offender, I'd probably be more likely to say a person who was convicted of sexual offenses, or a person who engaged in sexually offensive conduct, a wide variety of different things. But I can tell you that first and foremost, this term is a legal term and not a clinical term. There's no specific clinical profile of a sexual offender. It's actually quite a wide variety of different types of people who engage in a lot of different types of behavior for a lot of different types of reasons. So, sex offender is someone who has broken the law, engaged in a behavior that has some sexual element to it. So, sexual offender as a term encompasses a wide range of unlawful sexual behaviors, not all of which would be diagnosable with as being actually paraphilic. Now that's an important term for us in this short video. Paraphilia those are the sexual disorders. When we look at the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, so we're in the 5th edition. This is the sort of diagnostic Bible for psychiatry, psychology, mental health counseling, social work. Anybody who works in the mental health field will be reasonably familiar with the DSM. And the DSM defines paraphilias in a certain way, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But those are all ilias and isms. So, for instance, pedophilia, fetishism, exhibitionism, sexual sadism, those are all things that we would class broadly as being paraphilias. One of the things that I think is really important to recognize is that not every person who is a sex offender is necessarily paraphilic, in that the reasons for engaging in the behavior are not necessarily because you have a diagnosable condition. There may be other reasons why people engage in sexually deviant acts, meaning that they've engaged in the sexually deviant behavior, but they're not necessarily inherently sexually deviant in their interest profile. Okay? However, from a risk assessment standpoint, it's important for us when we're working with clients, especially within a circle, if your core member has been diagnosed with one of those paraphilias, that would signify that perhaps his risk to engage in new sexually offensive conduct is somewhat higher, based on that risk factor at least, than someone who has engaged in similar behavior but is not diagnosed with that paraphilia. We know that when we look at the meta-analytic research, that people who have sexually deviant interests tend to reoffend more often than people who do not. Another really important consideration when we're talking about kind of sexual deviance is the issue of consent. And one of the difficulties with consent is that it's a bit difficult for us to get our head around, and we're not terribly consistent about what constitutes consent or who can give it and under what circumstances. So I guess the first thing to say is that if we're going to use the sort of strictest example of what constitutes informed consent, it has to have 3 elements. First, it has to be given freely. So the consent to sexuality has to be given freely, without any inducement, without force, without coercion, without there being an inherent power differential that would lead someone to believe that they had to do something. So both parties should say, yep, I like you, I think you're really cool, I think you're really hot, I want to have sex with you. Both parties are able to give that consent freely. Okay, so there's that element of it. The second part of it is that it has to be given intelligently, meaning that the person has the capacity to give that consent. Okay, so we don't believe that children under a certain age are actually intelligent enough when it comes to sexuality to give consent. We also know that there are times when there may be a mental health condition or some sort of an intellectual disability or a brain injury that might impact someone's ability to make that sort of intelligent decision whether or not they want to engage in sex. Sometimes that can be impacted by alcohol or drugs as well, which you can see that there's some element of the freely given element that overlaps here. The third aspect is that the informed consent has to be given in a knowing fashion, meaning that the person has all the elements or understands all of the elements of what they're actually going to be doing and have been informed as to what exactly this means. So we're going to have sex, this is what we're going to do, or this is what what's potentially on the table. So there aren't any surprises. There isn't anything that comes up that the person didn't quite anticipate. Okay? So in order for consent to be informed, it has to be freely giving, it has to be intelligent, and it has to be knowing. You can't hold back some important element about it. Who can give consent, I think, is a really important question for us. And this is where we tend to be a bit inconsistent. When we talk about age of consent, this can be a big issue, right? So certainly laws vary from country to country and even from state to state here in the United States regarding who's old enough to have sex and under what circumstances. The most common age of consent in the United States is 16, but there's a range from 16 to 18. So I live in Florida. Age of consent in Florida is 18. In New York, where I often do a lot of work and where my son sometimes goes to visit his mother, age of consent is 17. In states like Alabama, for instance, which is sort of next door to Florida, age of consent there is 16. Sort of begs the question, are the children of Alabama somehow more easily prepared to engage in sexual activity than their counterparts in New York, who are somehow a year ahead of their counterparts in Florida? Or is this a socially constructed thing? I don't see any good reason to believe that the adolescents in Florida, New York, or Alabama would be significantly different from one another. Hence, the issue here is what's the social standard in that state? Age of consent in Canada is 16. It was recently changed within the last 5 years, but had been at 14 since the late 1800s. So does that mean that somehow children in Canada, are now 2 years less able to give, consent to sexuality? Or is this again something that's been determined by a consensus of the people of the country? And that would be, that would appear to be the case. Age of consent in most European countries is 14. There are some countries in the world that have no age of consent at all. Or there are other countries where if you want to consent to sexuality, you have to be married. If you're not married, you can't legally consent to sex. So, given that I think, with some minor differences between races and, between different cultures, there may be different perspectives on what age is, acceptable for what. But biologically, we're all probably pretty much the same. We may have slightly different skin pigmentation. There may be differences, slight differences in body shape. But for the most part, kids hit puberty somewhere between 11 and 14 and, are at least biologically prepared to engage in sexual activity at an earlier age than some places allow them to, given, what the age of consent is that's set by law. And I have no comment on that other than to say that it's a moving target, that what constitutes, sort of inappropriate conduct in one jurisdiction may not constitute inappropriate conduct in another jurisdiction, and that's a socially contrived thing. From a sexological standpoint, I'd be much more concerned about body shape. So as we spoke before, I think it's quite unreasonable for a person who has a physically mature body shape to be sexually interacting with someone who has a physically immature body shape. And as we talked about before, that's essentially prepubescent children or the early pubertal children who are still going through the changes and who still, from a, if we were to look at them, would look and say that's clearly someone who has a childlike body shape as opposed to an adult body shape. Now this gets a little bit confusing because there are some people who would be under the age of consent who would be physically mature. So you have to ask yourself whether or not that's reasonable conduct. And in the state of Florida, it's quite likely that there are, a large number of people between the ages of 14 and 18 who are physically mature, but who are still, according to law, not able to consent to sexual behavior in certain circumstances. And again, that's something that the standard has been set by the local jurisdiction, and it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the body shape of the people who are involved. From the standpoint of trying to diagnose sexual deviance, we're looking for something where it's quite clear that the behavior has some inherently deviant aspect to it. So, speaking of the age of consent thing, we wouldn't necessarily see someone who is, say for instance 22 years old having sex with someone who's 16 years old in Florida. That would be against the law, but it's not necessarily sexually deviant in that both people are probably of physically mature body shape. There may be other circumstances that would render it, inappropriate conduct, socially inappropriate, sexually inappropriate, and depending on the circumstances and what behaviors were actually engaged in, there may be some element of sexual deviance there as well. But it wouldn't be related to the level of actual secondary sex characteristics development. I hope I'm not getting too confusing with this. One of the other elements that makes it difficult for us in terms of defining what constitutes sexual deviance is that we don't really know what causes it. So there's a lot of inconsistency in terms of our perspectives on where this came from. And what we have to realize, I guess, is that there are various theories of sexual deviance that are at times, sort of complementary to one another, and that at other times are kind of contradictory. And I guess what I would say, and I'll go out on a limb here, that we'll probably never have a single unifying theory of sexual deviance that will be satisfactory to everyone in the field. There are some people who are, sort of social learning theory folks who believe that we learn this behavior from early times in our lives. There are other people who say that there's probably some level of brain function that's unique to people who have certain sexual preferences, and that may be true, right? Both of those may be true, but being able to say that one or the other is the answer in every case would be very, very difficult for us. So when we think about social learning theory, the idea here is that there's modeling and observation, repeated exposure to certain stimuli, and that there's, kind of intermittent reinforcement of certain types of behavior, and that this ultimately shapes what sort of sexual things we're interested in and what we're likely to behave, how we're likely to behave going forward. This would be where we would question whether or not pornography was pertinent. Does early exposure to pornography change people in some way? Does it change how we think about sex? Does it change what sort of people we'd be interested in when it comes to sex? If you had a child who was exposed to lots and lots of pictures of naked men, would that, and that child was male, would that necessarily mean that child would grow up to be gay? I don't think we have any strong evidence to suggest that would be true. At the same time, if the opposite were true, if we had a young girl who was exposed to lots and lots of pornography that showed sort of naked men, would that necessarily mean that she's going to grow up to be heterosexual? Who knows? There's also some question out there as to whether or not repeated exposure to child pornography, whether that increases the likelihood that someone is going to be pedophilic. At this point, I think it's fairly safe to say that the science is still trying to answer some of these questions for us. Although at this point, the research literature has pretty much failed to show a strong connection between pornography and sexual offending. But the results are pretty complicated. So there are some results that would suggest that people surf what they're interested in. So people look at the kind of pornography that they're most interested in. So if you're an average heterosexual male, if you were going to look at pornography, you would probably be looking at naked pictures or videos of female adults. If you're gay, then you're going to look at people who are of the same sex, and there may be a certain body shape that you like. Some guys like large breasts, some guys like smaller breasts. Some guys like women who are, a little Rubenesque. Some guys like women who are a little thinner, and the same thing goes, with respect to people who have a same-sex interest. The body shape and how much hair they have and whether or not they're tattooed or this, that, and the other thing. Everybody has their own, sort of interest. Just as an aside, if you're interested in what turns people on, I would highly recommend a book called A Billion Wicked Thoughts by Ogie Ogus and Cy Gaddam, published a few years ago. Very interesting in terms of what sorts of things people search for on the internet when they search for something related to sexuality. The simple answer to this, I suppose, is that at this point we have no concrete evidence to suggest that simply surfing a certain type of porn is going to increase the likelihood that you engage in behavior that's in line with what you've been surfing. And pretty typically people look at what they're interested in. Another way of looking at sexually deviant behavior is to look at it in the context of a clinically diagnosable syndrome. So this is the medical model. Is there something about a certain type of people that they're more likely to have a certain type of sexual interest? And when we think about the paraphilias, this would be the sort of result of a medical or a sort of clinical approach to categorizing sexual deviance. In this, you would perhaps believe that there is some medical or psychiatric treatment that might be applied, and we certainly know that for some sexual offenders or people who engage in sexually offensive behavior, that there is there are some medications that can be taken that decrease the likelihood of engaging in sexual behavior overall, and there's some suggestion that some medications are helpful in turning down the volume, I suppose, on the urges for people to engage in some of the more deviant sexual acts. And this would be kind of therapeutic sex drive reduction, or as it's sometimes referred to, it's known as chemical castration. And this is where you take a medication that affects the levels of the sex hormone testosterone, on the belief that somehow testosterone is the major factor in both sexual urges and fantasies and what sexual behaviors you're going to engage in from a physical sense. There's some truth to that. One of the difficulties with the medical model, though, is that there's no general psychiatric profile of a person who engages in sexually offensive conduct. It would appear, and it's certainly been my experience over the last 33 years that I've been doing this, that people who engage in sexually offensive conduct come from all walks of life. There are adolescents who do this, there are young adults, there are middle-aged adults, there are older adults, there are elderly people who engage in this behavior. Some of them are doctors and lawyers, some of them are kind of construction workers or unemployed people. I suppose the only single factor theory that you could use to explain kind of sexually deviant conduct would be gender, in that approximately 95% of the people who engage in sexually inappropriate conduct are male. Although clearly there are some female offenders out there as well, and we probably underestimate their numbers. When we think about the DSM-5, and this is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the so-called Bible for the mental health field, when we think about paraphilias, this is the definition you get from the book. A paraphilia is any intense and persistent sexual interest other than sexual interest in genital stimulation or preparatory fondling with phenotypically normal, physically mature, consenting human partners. So let's break that down for a moment. So if you're engaging in sexual behaviors, genital stimulation, whether that's oral, digital, penile, whatever, or preparatory fondling, which would be the sort of heavy petting and stuff like that, with phenotypically normal. When we say phenotypically normal, we mean people who are sort of average-looking people, right? So they've got 5 toes on 5 fingers on each hand and foot. They've got 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, 1 nose, 2 ears. There's nothing specifically about them that when you just looked at them physically, you'd say, well, there's something unique about that person. And we know that there are some people out there who are sexually excited by amputees, or by people who are quite extremely obese, or who have certain deformities. So when we talk about phenotypically normal, we're talking about broadly average people. We're talking about physically mature, as I mentioned before, and consenting. So we've covered those two elements before. The other part of this is there's also included in the definition sexual interest greater than or equal to normophilic sexual interest. So what we consider to be normal, and I'd say that our perspective on what's considered normal is probably a lot broader than in some of the earlier versions of the DSM. But if you're more sexually aroused to exposing yourself than you are to having normative, kind of sexual interactions with a consenting partner, if you're either equally or greater, if you experience equal or greater sexual arousal from exposing, then that might be a means by which to give the diagnosis as well. One of the neat things about the DSM-5 is that it actually separates paraphilias from paraphilic disorders. So it's now possible for someone to have interest in something that we might classify as being sexually deviant without necessarily having the deviance disorder. So for instance, there is an emerging population of men who have acknowledged that they have sexual interest in children, but for whatever reason, they've been able to inhibit themselves and they don't act on that. And they sort of band together as a kind of collective to assist each other in making good decisions, in kind of keeping themselves from engaging in the behavior that would go along with their interest. So in that instance, we would say that those individuals have pedophilia, but they do not have pedophilic disorder. Pedophilic disorder would be if the possession of the paraphilia is something that causes distress for them or causes them to experience some negative circumstances in their life or causes them to engage in sexually inappropriate conduct with others that causes some distress or consequences for them. So in this instance, if they acknowledge that they have the sexual interest in children, then they have pedophilia, but until it becomes a problem for them, it's not pedophilic disorder. Okay, and this I suppose would go along with some of the BDSM folks as well, in that there are many couples that include some aspect of bondage and discipline in their sex play, sometimes to quite an extreme, right? I mean, things that ordinary people might not consider, and we might say that constitutes a paraphilia. But as long as they have the consent of each other, as long as they're enjoying themselves, they're able to function otherwise in their lives, and it doesn't cause distress for them or others, we would not say that was a paraphilic disorder. In terms of the paraphilias, there are 8 named paraphilias in the DSM-5. And we've characterized these into a number of different groupings. So the first grouping would be those behaviors that are aimed at a certain type of target. And here the paraphilias would be pedophilia, fetishism, and also transvestism. So what sexually arouses them is a person or a thing. Okay, so with respect to pedophilia, it's children. With fetishism, it can be shoes or nylons or leather or some other inanimate object. With respect to transvestism, the interesting thing about this is that these are people who are sexually aroused by the woman that they dress up as. So again, this is oriented towards a certain target. So those are the 3 named paraphilias that would refer to target preferences. In terms of activity preferences, we have 8 named paraphilias in 2 groupings. The first grouping are what we call the courtship disorders, and that's voyeurism, exhibitionism, and frauderism. Frauderism is the act of either sort of copping feels or rubbing up against somebody. Often happens in elevators or crowded buses or that sort of thing. And those are the courtship disorders, the idea being that these are not necessarily behaviors that are that are uncommon. It's the context, I suppose, and the means by which they express themselves. The second group are the algolagnic disorders, and these are the ones that talk about pain and suffering. So here we have sexual masochism and sexual sadism, and these often go together, why we often say S&M, right? So two different types of activity preference, two different types of activity preference paraphilias in the DSM-5. One of the things that DSM-5 also notes, and there are two catch-all diagnoses that are in there. One is called other specified paraphilic disorder, and the other is called unspecified paraphilic disorder. I'll talk about unspecified first. So unspecified paraphilic disorder are those types of behaviors or urges or fantasies or that sort of thing that meet the general criteria for a paraphilia, but that you're not exactly sure what it is. It's not something that's perhaps been talked about in the literature, or the person may not have all of the sort of main criteria for diagnosis of a paraphilic disorder. So you're not sure exactly what's going on, but you see something that's unusual, it's intense, it's persistent, and it sort of feels like a paraphilia, but you don't really know what to call it. The other category falls under other specified, and when we talk about other specified, this is where the condition that you see is something that meets all of the normal criteria for diagnosis of a paraphilia. It's not one of the named 8, but it's something that we generally know something about. There's been some discussion of it in the scientific literature, and the reason why it doesn't have its own set of diagnostic criteria is because maybe it's a little more rare. With respect to the activity preference stuff, two of the more common ones would be biastophilia, which is a sexual preference for engaging in rape behavior. This is a somewhat controversial diagnosis. And the other one would be obscene phone calling, which we call telephone scatologia. And this is someone who gets sexually excited by phoning people and engaging in, all manner of, bad sexual talk or whatever on the telephone. In the 21st century, we see this also with respect to texting, Skype, and other sorts of things. So there are people who also, get a lot of sexual excitement from engaging in sexually inappropriate conduct over the internet, or over a cell phone, or over social media. When we talk about the target preferences, 4 of the more commonly discussed, sort of target preference paraphilias would be Europhilia, which is not sexual preference for people from Europe. From Europe, by the way, it's people who like to include urine in their sexual play. So that would be number 1. Number 2 would be coprophilia. So these are people who like to include feces in their sex play. Necrophilia is for people who have a strong sexual urge to have sex with dead bodies. And then the last one we'll talk about would be gerontophilia, for people who have a strong sexual interest in people who are quite considerably older than them, people who are in the elderly range. The DSM says there are many dozens of different paraphilias that could potentially be diagnosed under other specified paraphilic disorder, some of which would be considered quite rare. One of the other things that I like about the DSM-5's conceptualization of the paraphilias is that we're no longer looking at this from a taxonic standpoint, meaning are they yes or are they no a certain thing. So is there someone who is your sort of classic exhibitionist versus someone who is not? Or is this something on a continuum? Is it dimensional? And we see that this is probably true. Most things, are on some sort of a continuum. There are people who, when we think about the so-called chronophilias, So, sort of sexual interests that are based on age. So there would be pedophilia, which is those people who are sexually interested in prepubescent children. There would be hebephilia, which is a somewhat, sort of controversial topic. But those are people who have sexual interests in early adolescence. So people who are still in the midst of that, sort of pubertal change. There is ephebophilia, people who are later adolescents. Then you would have androphilia and also gynephilia, which are, sort of sexual preferences for female or male adults. Then, of course, you have gerontophilia, which we talked about before. So this sort of gives you the sense of that there is a dimension that some people like very young children, some people like older children, some people like pubescent children, some people like older teenagers, some people like, adults generally, and some people like quite elderly adults. So it's a dimension. I think we also see this with respect to sexual dangerousness. So when we think about the sexuality that involves some level of coercion or violence, we can see that this is also on a continuum, and that on the low end of that continuum would be only the amount of violence that's required to ensure the compliance of the person that you're trying to have sex with. So there might be some passive coercion. There may be some threats. The threats may then escalate to use of weapons to underscore those threats. Some physical violence may be included. And as we get further up that continuum, we get further away from simple coercion and more into sexual sadism, where the intent is to terrorize the person that you're having sex with and to have them be quite frightened, perhaps physically harmed, and for this to be a really horrific experience for them. And it's that horror, the shame, the embarrassment, the terror that the victim experiences that's driving the sexual arousal for the sexual sadist. So if we think about it, on the one end, you have this the somewhat more benign, sexual coercion, which would be, oh, come on, you said you would, let's go ahead and do it, to the point where the person might actually relent, although they were disinclined to engage in the behavior. So more about manipulation than about actual force. Moving further up that continuum until we get up to the quite, seriously dangerous behaviors that are going to involve perhaps some strangling or choking or cutting or burning, some foreign insertions, and in fact, in some cases, might even involve the death of the victim, all of which would be part and parcel of what's driving the offender's sexual interest. So we're looking at this, I guess, in two senses. One is the strength. So is this something that they primarily would rather do, or is it something that's exclusive? So, and certainly when we look at most people who are convicted of sexual offenses, most of them are not exclusive in their sexually inappropriate conduct. In that people who rape others often have sex with people with their consent. People who have had sexual interactions with children sometimes also have sexual interactions with adults. Sometimes we have people who are exclusive, where their sole means of achieving sexual pleasure is through engaging in behaviors that are somehow sort of paraphilic in nature, in that your person may never have had sex with anybody other than a child. Okay. We also look at it in terms of the relativity. Is the interest in this greater than or equal to those so-called normophilic interests? Is it a passing fancy? Is it the sort of thing they do quite infrequently? Or is it something that happens with so much more frequency that it suggests that this is what the preferred mode of behavior would be? The last thing I want to talk about is, how do we diagnose paraphilias? So I guess the first thing that we would say is that we can look at patterns of behavior. The more often something happens, the more often that there's something about it that the individual likes. So if you have a core member who's been sexually involved with one child, You can certainly say that that's inappropriate conduct and that it should never happen again, but it doesn't give you an awful lot of information, just on its face about whether or not that interaction was driven by inherently sexually deviant interests or preferences. If it happened twice, you get a little more information. 3 times, and you're starting to see a pattern, right? The more often it happens, the more likely it is that it's something that the individual likes. And we see this in other parts of our life as well, right? I mean, if you were to ask anybody what kind of food they like, or actually you wouldn't probably need to ask them what kind of food they like. If you, stayed with them for a week, you could probably deduce that just by how often they prepare a certain type of meal. So, if you're staying with someone and they have pizza 5 times that week, you can pretty much guess that pizza is one of their preferred foods, right? The same sort of thing goes with sexual behavior. Look at the sort of people that they're typically involved with, and that gives you some sense of what's going on. You can also look at it from the perspective of their behavior. So things that you observe that may not be as obvious. So, if you are a PO, and you're supervising someone with a history of sexually interacting with children, and you're not quite sure whether or not they have some deviant sexual interest in children over and above simply having engaged in the behavior, if you do any of your supervision visits out in the community and you catch them staring at kids, that might be an indication. It might be something that you could use to say that this person has some strong degree of interest in kids. Of course, one other way that you could look at this is if your core member just flat out tells you, I'm concerned about how much I think about little boys. That's a statement against interest. In my entire career, I've very, very rarely, in fact, I think on only one occasion, did I have someone who confessed to having deviant sexual interest where I didn't believe that it was true. And that person was trying to achieve some other kind of secondary gain. The last way, I suppose, is to use some objective testing. And the main way that we would do this is to look at male sexual arousal. So back in the 1960s, Masters and Johnson were able to demonstrate that if you wanted to measure male sexual arousal, that one of the easiest ways to do that would be to look at what's happening with the penis. We know that when men are sexually aroused, their penis is engorged, it gets larger, and when they're sort of sexually disaroused, whatever the right word would be, that they tend to remain flaccid. There is a test known as the penile plethysmograph, or the PPG as it's often referred to. The clients have somewhat more colorful terms for it. They call it the pecker checker or the Peter meter or the wangometer. The idea here is to be able to measure sexual response in the penis on presentation of audiovisual stimuli. So, presentation of stimuli that pertain to children versus pertaining to adults, and see which one of those two categories causes the most sexual arousal. The general idea being that if the individual consistently shows more sexual arousal to children than to adults, that person probably has a pedophilic preference. There are a number of different ways to measure male sexual arousal using sort of penile plethysmograph. Tends to be somewhat controversial. It started off as a pure research tool just to look at sexual arousal, period. In the 1950s or so, an Eastern European sexologist named Kurt Freund adapted the method for use in trying to diagnose various paraphilic presentations, and that's sort of largely how it's been used. And it requires the individual to disrobe to a certain degree and place an apparatus over their penis, which would then allow for some measurement of what's happening in penile physiology in reaction to the presentation of those audiovisual stimuli. Obviously, this is probably somewhat controversial, and it's not an acceptable diagnostic method in all jurisdictions. There are some places that are sort of more commonly likely to use it. Certainly where I'm from, which is Ontario, Canada, it's quite commonly used there in the diagnosis of people who have engaged in sexually inappropriate conduct. Depending on where you are in the United States, it may or may not be used. There are some places in the United States that have some issues with potentially what stimuli are being used, or the idea that you would connect an apparatus to an individual's penis as being something that might breach their civil rights. So, I mean, there are some controversies involved in that, and there are other methods that have been used. Visual reaction time. So this is the idea that how much people stare at certain types of pictures in comparison to other types of pictures gives us some sense of what their sexual interest is. And this raises an important question. The PPG measures sexual arousal, in that we're seeing actually what's happening in the penis, which Masters and Johnson told us is perhaps the best way to measure male sexual arousal, versus things that are more cognitively oriented, which tell us about sexual interest. And we're inferring that somebody's sexually more interested in one type of person versus another type of person based on how long they linger on photos of that particular type of person. At this point, I think there's still a lot of research to be done about some of the visual reaction time stuff. That there are some other methods out there that also require a lot more research at this point. The last thing that I'd like to finish off with is just one of my colleagues here in Florida, whose name is Dr. Jill Levinson, has made, I think, a pretty decent attempt at trying to conceptualize sexual deviance. And what she has are two dimensions. So think of it as being like this. This dimension is the degree to which someone has deviant sexual interests, or deviant sexual preference. This axis is the degree to which they can regulate themselves. So you've got sexual deviance and self-regulation, and you've got high on this end and low on this end, and you've got low on this end and high on this end. Okay? So low here, high here, low here. In terms of looking at where people fit in those four quadrants, on those quadrants where you have the two pluses, which I think is what I said was here, so plus and plus, those would be the people who have high sexual deviance but high self-regulation. So this might be, for instance, people who have a paraphilic interest or a paraphilic preference but don't act on it. Okay? In the other quadrant down here, where you have people who are high on the self-regulation but low on sexual deviance, these are people who are ordinary folks. They have healthy sexual and personal boundaries, not likely to get themselves in much trouble. If we go over to this quadrant, where you have low self-regulation and low sexual deviance, these are people who engage in essentially criminal hypersexuality. So people who don't have a lot of sexually deviant interests, but they have a hard time, sort of moderating themselves. So these are people who may engage in sexuality that's somehow harmful for themselves. It might end up being harmful for others as well. The last quadrant up here, these are the folks who are high in sexual deviance and low in self-regulation. So these are folks who are engaging in essentially paraphilically disordered sexual conduct, people who are getting themselves into trouble, people who spend a lot of time on the internet downloading child pornography, low self-regulation, high sexual deviance. These are folks who are going to engage in a lot of sort of problematic behavior. So folks on this side are the ones where we're going to be seeing some problems. Folks on this side are where things are probably reasonably okay, although these folks up here who have both high sexual deviance and high self-regulation, they need to be mindful of the fact that they have those deviant sexual interests that they're going to have to continue to manage. So that's one way of trying to conceptualize sexual deviance, and of course I would encourage you to get the PowerPoint presentation, because it's going to make it a lot easier to take a look at that while you're listening to the video. So, in a nutshell, that's our short discussion about sexual deviance. I hope that you've learned something from this. I hope that it's sort of informed you in some way. If you have questions about anything that I talked about here, by all means feel free to shoot me an email. If you go to my website, www.robinjwilson.com, there's an email address there, and I'd be happy to respond if you have any queries. Otherwise, remember that that's also where you'll find the PowerPoint for this video, which will be under the Circles of Support and Accountability tab. So with that, I'll sign off, and thank you for your time.